I'll do an intro. So,
Very
greetings to like both of you. Uh, I'm David. With me is Jeric. Jeric listened to a couple of episodes of our podcast, had some questions, some thoughts, some can I don't want to say concerns. I don't want to put words in, but feedback.
that's
Uh,
good.
okay, feedback. And then we had a discussion, a meeting, and kind of talked about a couple of things about maybe points that in the podcast were being overlooked, etc. And then that discussion evolved into several different points. And so we reconvened for another meeting, and this one we're going to kind of focus on evolution. It's one of the topics that was brought up as a point to sort of take apart, deconstruct, and discuss. So, with that, no further ado, Jeric. Um, so how that came about is the last one we were talking, and I don't remember how, but then at some point, I think you said like you don't believe in evolution. And I said, well, yes, like I very much do. And you said, well, wait a minute, what about? And I don't remember. There was a couple of things, but I wanted to just kind of turn over to you and say like, um, either your process to where you are now, or major points, or what your problems or concerns. Like, yeah, that like with evolution.
So I think definitions are important
Yeah.
because not everybody means the same thing when they even say the word evolution. So um, you know, what I will say is if we're talking about um, microevolution, where we're talking about adaptations within a species, within a kind, based on environmental factors for that species' survival. Uh, Absolutely. I think we see evidence of that. I think that's clear. I don't think too many people dispute that. I think where there is a leap, in my view, is in the idea of macroevolution, kinds becoming whole different other kinds. And that I don't think is really, I don't think science has proven that at all. I don't think that there's any evidence for that at all. I think that it takes as much of a leap to get there with faith as it does that atheists accuse theists of having in their argument for creation. And so I think in order to hold to it, you have to have such a firm hold on a naturalistic worldview that there is only a naturalistic explanation for things where you exclude the possibility of anything outside of a naturalistic explanation. I think that's the only way that you can conclude that evolution is true is if you start from the beginning that there's an impossibility, that it's impossible for anything outside of a naturalistic explanation. Um, in my view, I think it requires that level of commitment to that worldview in order to dismiss a lot of the evidence against evolution.
Mhm.
Um, and so that's where I would begin. Um, yeah, I don't want to just keep blabbering on, so I'll let you ask another question before I or respond to that if you have anything to say to that.
Yeah, lots of things to say, but I want to start with another question because you said definitions are important, and I agree.
Mhm.
What is your definition of kind?
So kind, and this isn't well, maybe it is a little bit. I'm not a biologist. I'm not an expert on uh, all things in this area. I would say kind is going from cats to dogs, right?
Hmm.
Uh, so uh, kind in the aspect of not mammals and reptiles. Those are different categories, but within the function of the basics of what makes up I've heard the word body plan used, right? So a particular
Body plan.
plan, PLAN. So excuse me, a particular body type or a body plan that would remain pretty much the same within various species within that kind. So horses, zebras, donkeys, right?
Mhm.
That's all one kind, right? To go from a horse to a elephant, now you're switching kinds, um, is my understanding.
Okay, then one of my other questions would be why this usage of this word? Because like in biology, in taxonomy, like we have classifications and a strata already. We have like genus, homid, there like kingdom, phyla. We already have a structure to categorize and then subcategorize more specific groups like this.
Mhm.
So like there's already like a pretty well-known system to say like, well, not this group. Why the usage of kind? Because that seems confusing. I'm not even like I'm still not entirely sure. Like it sounds like you're saying kind is any group that's similar, but if it gets too dissimilar, like a horse and a zebra, that's a kind. A horse and an elephant, that's not. But like you can see that there's going to be fringes on the edges here that gets confusing. You know,
Well, it's just I'll just look it up.
look up kind.
Yeah, to see if it's what I'm to see if what I find is what I am thinking of.
Okay. Are you just Googling?
I am.
All right. Because I'm thinking it's going to come up with a definition of the word kind, like,
Well, I put it in biology as it relates to biology. A biological kind can be defined as any group of organism that shares a bottom level taxonomic orphan genes, which shares no homologous
mhm,
homologous.
homologous,
There you go. Thank you.
similar.
Relationship with any other genes in other populations, and then it goes into the difference between
Hmm.
evolution and creation. So I would, I'm looking up one more thing here. So there are some notes on here that says it's not as, I will say, black and white, um, in some areas. And so in your, response, you said, hey, there would be some areas on the fringes.
Yeah.
There,
And that, sorry, real quick, but that, and it sounded like you were using it as this definitive barrier. You were saying micro macro evolution and saying this, yes, but not this. Why not this? Because there's this barrier, and the kind can't become this kind. But if it's not black and white, and if there's fuzzy edges, then the whole structure of like, I think this, not this, seems to suddenly kind of be on trepidation, precarious ground.
yeah, let me look something up here real quick and I'll tell you
Sure.
why.
Like, I would ask this almost.
So the reason why kind is important, God made the beasts of the earth after their kind, the cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps on the ground after its kind, right? That's Genesis 1:25.
Okay, so
So so so if there is if God created according to some form of barrier, right, after its kind, right, there will be distinctions among those creatures that would remain
why?
permanently, right?
Why?
Because they were created, uh, initially with these distinctions, and in the process of reproduction, they would continue to reproduce along those same distinctions, whatever those distinctions are.
Are you drawing that from that verse? because like I don't. I from that verse, which again, we're we're constructing a biological definition that is universal for all living organisms based on the English translation of a word, kind. I don't know what the original Aramaic means, like, and I don't think it has biological implications, but nevertheless, that to me says that God made everything according to these groups. It doesn't say like, and those groups can never shift. Those groups can never change. It just says, I made them like this. There seems to be this inference within that text that, and they remain completely the same. Why that?
And I wouldn't say that, but what I would say is that beyond that, I don't think that there is any evidence to point to that showing up in nature itself,
What's
right?
that? What do you mean? There's no evidence of that showing up in nature?
Meaning that what we talked about, what I started off um, with in the sense of you don't really have, and this is one of the things that I was going to get to, but um, you don't really see transitional fossils in the fossil record, right? So what you have is fossils that demonstrate um, species within a certain category, and then you have another category, but you don't see the evidence of the small transitions that would need to occur in order to support evolution as the way that we have the diversification of species. You just don't see it. It's not there. And so um, what we do see is species in particular groups or categories that have certain likenesses that produce again after their own kind, according to what scripture says. But you don't see the the transition between a horse and a hippopotamus, for example. I'm not saying that that's the order. I'm just saying you just don't see that.
Sure.
We don't observe it, and we don't see evidence of it when we look back through history. And so there's no reason for me to think that that verse means anything other than how I'm interpreting that verse, because we don't have any evidence to suggest that it does mean anything other than that. Now, with that being said, this brings me to a point I wanted to say. Um, One of the things that you shared was that you kind of grew up on Ken Ham.
And others, but yeah.
Yeah, real kind of strong. Um, and so, there's a wide range of interpretations, even as you just challenged me there. So that's how I'm looking at that. There are theists who would look at that and maybe feel closer to what you're saying, is that no. I do think that there's some broader range there based on their understanding, based on their scientific knowledge, based on interpretations of the science and of scripture. And so I think there is a um I think there are some things that aren't as definitive as speaking solely of Ken Ham, for example.
Okay.
Um, I think there are things that are not as definitive as he presents them to be in terms of scripture, even in the interpretations of the Hebrew, understanding of the literature. I don't think that. I think that there's some who um, some theists who are very solid and grounded in their faith, that believe in old earth or older earth, maybe not billions and billions of years old, but an older earth than 6,000 years old. And I think there are some who are just strictly, we have a young earth and that's just what it is. um you know
Wait,
I'm not.
sorry. I apologize real quick. I just want to, curiosity. You said
Mhm.
there's people who believe like they don't believe in an old Earth, they're a young Earth creationists, and there's people who believe in an old Earth but not 3.4 billion years old.
Correct. Or some might even believe that. Oh, there's a
Right.
range. It's not like either or, you know.
I'm just curious about the people who are like, yeah, it's old, but it's not that old. Like they don't believe it's 6 to 10,000 years old, like a young Earth creationist. They're like, no, it's definitely older than that. It's 12 million years old, but they don't think it's 3.4
Yeah.
billion.
And that's just, you know, that's just providing the range for it. It's not like I've interviewed every Christian, but I do think that there are people who allow for an older Earth understanding based on what their understanding is, without feeling like it violates any reading of Genesis 1,
And
right?
yeah, I got it.
And so I think, you know, if you ask me where, you know, where am I I tend to think more older Earth. Um, I don't, it's not a hill that I would die on either way. You know, it's just, I don't find it necessary to, I don't think it's a hill to die on. Because I think there's room in scripture to land either way. I just do when I read it. And so I don't think it's anything that I violate if I say, okay, I believe that, um, you know, the earth is X amount of years old. But evolution does cause something that is a violation for me, because if you believe in evolution, you got to do away with original sin. It's gone. You do away with you do away with being made in the image of God. You do away with human dignity. You do away with all inherent human dignity. You do away with um, things like the um, existence of uh, absolute morality, for example. Um, and so that is something that you know, there are people that call themselves theistic evolutionists. I don't see that as a legitimate category of biblical theism, because so much of salvation rests on what are we saved from? You know, what did Christ die for?
You don't
How
think they could be a theistic evolutionist and believe in original sin, and that's what Christ saved them from?
I don't I don't I don't
Okay.
see I don't see where you get I don't see where the dignity of the human being comes from that makes them worthy of that without there being a creation.
Hmm.
The timing of it we can talk about. We can talk about who did what, when, and all of that sort of thing. But in terms of the creation of man and being special in that regard for God's um, creation, I don't see how you get there with quote unquote theistic evolution,
Sure.
um, and really hold to, you know, um, Romans 5:12, which says sin entered the world through Adam specifically, you know, uh, through one man, you know, that there was one at some point. At some point there was one, and this is how this came to be. And Christ, he bears down on that too many times. To now you got to start playing with the words of Christ and making them, you know, figurative in ways where he's talking very explicitly um,
About what?
uh,
Adam?
about, you know, marriage, even, for example, right? He says, you know, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and cling to himself. Adam, or Jesus quotes that verse specifically out of Genesis 2:24. And so he's not talking figuratively when he uses that language. He's talking specifically when he uses that language.
Right, but what is, I'm sorry, I got lost. What are we talking? Is this about original sin or is this about Adam?
Well,
Genesis?
that's connected, but yeah, but just the creation of Adam and the existence of Adam and Eve and being specific, that's something that's
Okay,
validated by
gotcha.
Christ himself. And so now once you start playing around with that,
Sure.
now I don't know
So
that. So
several things, but I mean, like, yeah, I don't believe in original sin. I think the theology of the New Testament doesn't also. I think that's something that was um, from thanks to Augustine shoehorned into Christian theology afterwards. It's not a theological concept in the New Testament. It does not seem. Um, but yeah, I stopped believing that a long time ago. I don't believe in objective morality, so obviously these things are fine. I don't believe in God, so it's easy for me to be an evolutionist in
sure.
that respect. But I think, as far as like, yeah, just several things. I mean, it's coming back to one thing I do want to touch on because I don't want to let it go by on not challenged, but commented on is that you talked about like transitional fossils or forms and that we
Mhm.
just didn't see them. And I'm like curious as to like where you're looking in the sense that we have an abundance of transitional fossil. Like the idea like, well, there's just no fossils, and maybe that wasn't your word fossils, but like
Mhm.
evidence of biological transitions. Like we got a shit ton of those. Like we have tons and tons and tons and tons of those.
So I would
And
love for you to don't just send them to me because I would love to
I don't
see.
have them in
Yeah,
my garage though. I mean, I
yeah,
don't,
yeah,
what do you
yeah.
mean?
But I mean, you obviously have read something, you've looked at some article, you've looked at whatever you believe that you're getting that information from, please send it to me because everything that I've read, everything that I've seen speaks exactly to the opposite of that. Now, again, definitions matter, right? So what you're calling a transition
Yeah,
may
so I
not
think
be a transition, right?
yeah, I think that's something fair to pack out. So first of all, I think it's usually a misconception about evolution. Like, and I know you were sort of speaking glibly or whatever, but like you don't see a transition from like a horse to a hippopotamus. If evolution found that, it would disprove evolution. That would not occur. That should not occur. Um, Things always evolve within a construct, like meaning an alligator will never give birth to a bird. Like that's just not. And if it did,
Yeah,
we'd be
yeah,
like,
of course.
well, shit. That goes so much for evolution.
Right.
Um, but so yeah, there is within these confines and structures transitional forms like Archaeopteryx, Tiktaalik. These are critical junctures of like so Archaeopteryx is a critical juncture of the transition, if you will, of the remaining dinosaurs into birds. And that's an oversimplification. I'm talking about tens of millions of years, but like this is a key creature, a fossil that we found, and we said, oh, okay, this has sort of representations of both dinosaurs and its future generations of like birds. Is it fair?
But you don't even see how you don't even see how your worldview reads that, right? There's no reason why that can't just be an individual species in itself, right?
It is an individual species in and of itself. Of
I'm
course it is.
saying I'm saying created separately with no intention of bringing.
So why did it only exist in the historical strata after dinosaurs before birds? Like it existed for this like 10 million years after dinosaurs and then birds came and it stopped existing.
There's a million reasons why it could have stopped existing in that period of time that doesn't have to. That's my key phrase, right? It doesn't, it's not necessary that it was a transitional species. It
No,
just
it's
could
not
have been
necessary, but I mean like
right.
it
So you're
is.
reading into it, you're saying it is, but you weren't there, David. So
Look,
you can't say that because it existed between this and this. That automatically means hands down that it was a transitional species, not that it could
sure.
have existed and it just became extinct in that same period of time. That is
Sure.
a possibility, right?
It's a
And so
statistical or mathematical possibility. It
and
is
it's not even a small one. So if we
no,
have
it's a super small one. It really is.
okay, but
So wait,
if
hold on,
every
hold on. I want to
no
go
no
back
no, let
to
me get this out. Let me get this out.
okay, go
If
for it.
if 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 all if if all of the diversification of species that we have today
Mhm.
are a result of transitions happening over the course of
I
history.
don't like. I don't know what you mean by the word. I would just say evolution. Like I'm not sure what
Right.
you mean by transition.
Let's just say that.
Okay.
We wouldn't have we would have mountains of these evidences of these middle ground, almost used to be this, about to be this. I'm going to use the word transitional species. They
Yeah.
were all over the place, and they
So
are not. They're
no,
just
they
not.
no. So they are. But hold on. So coming back to like this way of thinking about things, like that's I think it's a misunderstanding of what evolution is. So I'm going to put it out this way to try to break through this. You're a transitional form. I'm a transitional form. We are all everything that exists right now. Every bird, everything, every biologic on Earth is a transitional form. There is no endpoint. There wasn't like, well, we needed this thing to transition to this thing so we could get here. It is all transitioning. Every creature that has ever existed is transitioning. So there is no end goal or end point. It's just change, and then what changes best and adapts better or is more suited for the environment survives. So there was tons of transitional forms. The dodo bird, for example, is something that like changed, and it was like shit, that doesn't work, and so it died off. And it doesn't have something it transitioned into. Those creatures don't exist to transition into anything else. They are just there to exist. So Archaeopteryx just existed, and it's one example of a like a genus that then over time continued to change, and then we got birds. But it wasn't the goal to get birds, if that makes sense. Like everything is a transition, and there's mountains and mountains and mountains of evidence for that in Tiktaalik, or even like human beings from like Homo habilis, Homo like into Homo sapiens, Homo africanus, Homo afarensis, like all of these things. So last two things I'll say real quick. I want to come back to last time we were talking. I used this example of a puzzle, and you have a 500-piece puzzle. And if you come to this puzzle totally blind, not literally, but just like that, and you put it together and you end up with 475 pieces of the puzzle, but there's random ones missing everywhere. You can say, well, you don't have all the pieces, so it is not realistic to think this is a picture of the skyline of Paris because you don't have all of them. But there's 12 pieces right here that of the Eiffel Tower, and it looks like there should be 13, but that's the Eiffel Tower. And here's the Arc de Triomphe, and here's Notre Dame, and here's the Louvre. Like, this is Paris. And if you just sort of step back and say, what is the point of this thing without trying to put an agenda on it? And this is really, I think, the process. You'd be like, oh, it's to show a picture of Paris. If in that view, you just say, what is this thing trying to do? It's to show a picture of Paris. If you look at, for example, the taxonomical record, the biological record of all creatures, and you say, what does this look like? It is not shoehorning an interpretation from them. It's just like, oh, things keep changing, transitioning, if you will, evolving over time. That's all it is. So we look at this bird right here and we say, what's this thing? Well, oh, it transitioned from these things and then it transitioned into that thing. It could have been a bird just all on its own. It was. I'm not saying it wasn't. Like, again, its purpose was to exist and be. It wasn't trying to become anything else. The species of Archaeopteryx was just trying to survive. But its offsprings, it then sort of adapted again. The transitioning that every being is doing continued in that regard. That's the makeup of all of existence.
Yeah. Well, the problem with that analogy is if you know that it's going to be Paris, you have to have some idea that it's supposed to be Paris.
No, you don't have to have an idea that it is Paris. You just take the 475 pieces and you put it on the table and you look at it and say, what is this?
Yeah, but
Paris.
You can't do a puzzle if you don't have an idea of what the puzzle is supposed to be. If you got 470,
yeah, you can. How not? How can you not?
If you have 475 pieces of a puzzle and you don't have the box that the puzzle came in,
it's harder. But you start off with all the edge pieces, and then you take pieces, and do they match up? These are all blue, so it looks like skyline.
It's not like
these don't fit. This one
not like edge pieces. It would be like putting together a puzzle of, if you've seen some of these difficult puzzles, that would be like of just a desert where there's no real markers, right? There's not a lot of high points where you can go in here and here.
Sure.
It's not this clear puzzle that you're describing by your own analogy. And so it's not that you have all of these pieces. One, you don't even know how many pieces the puzzle has, right? So you're saying you have 475 pieces of a 500-piece puzzle, but you can have 475 pieces of a 9,000-piece puzzle,
Mhm.
right? And so you're making a lot of assumptions based on those puzzles pieces that you have, because you don't know how many puzzle pieces you have. You don't know the picture that you're trying to make. And so you're still bringing a worldview into your interpretation of how those puzzle pieces fit together. You
I
just are.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I get what you're saying, and I'm not saying interpretation doesn't have like this blind bias to drive it towards an end. I don't think. I think you were vastly underestimating the evidence that exists, including fossil, biological, like genetic everything that really does shine a
Let's
good
talk
light
about
on it.
genetics. Let's talk about genetics.
Sure.
So I talked to you about irreducible complexity.
Yeah.
What do you know about it?
It's I mean, I'm gonna be just straight up. It's a completely debunked challenge by Michael Behe to show that in a genetic level, evolution is not possible because of this base necessity that things couldn't have started from a simple enough structure, right? It is that certain structures chemically, biologically, are irreducibly complex. You can't start with a one. You need a three and for it to multiply. Um, but it has been time and time and time and time and time again debunked, including the metaphors that Michael Behe has used. Michael Behe has acknowledged in court that according to his definition of this, which is so broad, it would include things like astrology, and that's what his definition functions as. He's been shown by 3 different peer-reviewed scientific papers that challenged him and said, what about this? Here's an example that disproves that. He has not responded to any of those and just keeps kind of talking about it. Um, yeah, it's a theory to sell books, and a theory is too kind of a word.
Yeah, so uh, I'm not sure who uh, you know who these people are that have debunked this.
Peer-reviewed scientists, they put out peer-reviewed white papers on it and said, like, we did studies, here they are. One included his bacterial flagellum, his like famous core piece that he likes to cite, as far as he thinks the bacterial flagellum is the first evidence that sort of made him come up with this idea and said, this is irreducibly complex, it cannot be reduced and still function. And scientists said, yeah, it is, here you go. And they've shown bacterial flagellum can be reduced. Also, Michael Behe's definition says if you cannot reduce it and it keep its main function. And people said, yeah, sure, who gives a shit? If you can reduce it, but it does another function, it still has a function, and
yeah,
that's worthwhile.
that's the
Michael
argument.
Behe says that it does not count, and that does not prove anything. So that's saying if you have a car, but I remove the doors, it's not a car, and you can't drive it. And people are saying, no, you can still drive it. It's not as good and it's not as safe, but it's still a car that can be driven. And he says, nope, definitionally it's not.
No, that's a misrepresentation. Not
Okay.
what he said is whatever pieces are removed, that it won't function, not that it can still function or function at
Yes,
a
he says it
level.
will not function if you remove those pieces. And that's been proven to be not true. It functions, it has a new function. It doesn't have the same function. And people have acknowledged that. He's right. Again, like I'm trying to think of another example, but like the thing can no longer do what it was originally like doing. I'm not going to say designed for because it wasn't. But it can now do another thing. And so scientists have shown this, including with the bacterial flagellum, and said, see, it still does this, and this is useful, and that's why it could still function and exist. And he said, no, it either does this or it doesn't do anything. And they've shown that's not true. It does other things. We acknowledge it no longer can do that thing. True. But it still has a function.
Yeah, I didn't hear him denying the piece about that it doesn't do anything. So I don't know when.
He has not. No, sorry, he has not. I don't think it's accurate to say that he has denied that it does that. He has denied that that is a refutation of his argument on irreducible complexity, despite them saying, well, we've reduced it and it still functions. So it is not irreducibly complex. And he has said, no, it is, because it doesn't do its original function. That's his argument. Not that it doesn't happen, but that doesn't disprove his irreducible complexity. For example, like the
Yeah.
bacterial flagellum, but one of the examples he gives is the mousetrap. That the mousetrap has these like 9 parts, and if you take
Yeah.
one part, it doesn't work. And people said, yeah, it does. If you take all the other parts and just put it on the floor without the base wood, you've removed a part and it still functions. And he said, no, it's not a mousetrap anymore. And people said, yeah, it does. It still catches mice. And there's been others examples of this. Like you can reduce it and it still has a function or a different one that's still good. And he would say, no, that doesn't count. It's still irreducibly complex, basically.
Yeah. Anthony Flew talked about the I
Yeah.
and how, you got to get everything all at the same time. You can't,
Yeah, but you don't.
you can't, all of the parts need one another in order to be able to do what they're designed to do. And I will use the word design. Um, it, Everything is responding to the other thing. All of the pieces fit according to the right relationship and the right size with the parts that they are, existing in or next to. And so, everywhere we see parts fitting together in this way with a function, um, that's what we have is a design. We have parts being put together for a purpose, right? Anything that we do, my computer, your computer, whatever we have is parts being put together for a purpose.
Sure.
And so it's very interesting to me how adamant everything that we see, our entire experience with the world around us, whenever we see high levels of cooperation with elements coming together, we infer, we know that there is a designer around that has come from somebody's mind.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to ask you why are you so committed to that not being true?
Can you say that again differently? I wasn't sure. Why am I so committed to that
I'll say it
not being
differently.
true?
Why are you so committed to the idea of randomness being a better explanation than intentionality?
Okay. Um, I would say, I mean, I don't think you're going to like this, but I would say I'm certainly not committed to it. Um, it is the only explanation. And what I mean by that, because that sounds like committedness, right? It's more of like, there's an example here, an analogy that is often used, that I often use because I think it's really fucking good. But of like a courthouse, right? A trial. There's a defense and there's a prosecution.
Mhm.
Um, Randomness is the defense. And we're saying, why are we so committed to like that side? Because the prosecution has not showed up. There is no evidence of design or order. I'm
Well,
open to that,
well, go ahead.
but there isn't any design to that. So I just keep saying this is the only explanation we have. If design comes along and we say, oh, there you go, then I would say, is that a better explanation? Maybe. But I don't see any design anywhere outside of like what we do. And there's a catch to this, though. We have to understand and recognize, like, are you familiar with Rorschach tests?
It sounds familiar if you
Ink
explain it.
blots. You know, like it's a comical thing where like a psychiatrist will hold up like a weird picture of a black thing and they're like, what is this? And you say like, I see my father's disappointment. And they say, aha. Those are Rorschach tests. They're supposed to, they are meaningless things that you imbue meaning into, and then it tells you something about yourself, right? we as human beings evolutionarily have developed a way to see and interpret things in a cognitive meaningful way. A good analogy of this that I think Richard Dawkins used is like that was important so that when we look at the tall grass, we can see that some of those tall grass lines are actually the stripes of a tiger. And now we're in danger. And so we run. And the people who can see this and run survive. And the ones who don't and think it's just tall grass get eaten. And so that extra ability continues on. We see design where there is not design. We infer this all the time. We look like little kids look up at the sky and say, look, a sheep, and it's just clouds, right? We see things in the clouds. We are pattern recognizing machines is another way I've seen it put. We recognize patterns. That's what we do. That's how we've developed as far as we have. But it sometimes is a false proof, right? The same thing is like if you talk about like a car accident and they ask like the 10 witnesses what happened, they'll tell you 10 different stories because we're not perfect at this. We sometimes get things a little wrong. We will think we see design where there isn't design, like a mirage in the desert. There is design out here. I'm not saying there isn't. It is not intentionality. There is no mind behind this. Nature found systems that work well, and so they keep doing it. And so we see that. But that's not like a mind behind it.
Yeah, but whenever you talk about it, it's these borrowed terms. Nature found, right? Um, uh, that's assigning a mind to nature. You don't
No,
realize,
I'm sorry. I'm not trying to do that at all.
it's almost impossible to explain evolution, just to stay on subject,
Yeah.
without borrowing from these kinds of words, right? Even down to natural selection, right? And so the idea that there is the randomness that atheists suppose has to operate within some form of direction in order to get us here. We understand that because we can't deny the cooperation of nature, right? Because we often talk about, we talk about human beings, animals, reptiles, birds. We still have to evolve insects. We still have to evolve all plant life. All of these things have to happen. They have to happen in a coordinated effort to where this particular uh, insect has to evolve at the same rate, in the same time, in the same place as this particular plant that needs this particular insect. And we don't see how the 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 the
Why?
sheer magnitude. What I'm saying is there are plants that rely on these insects.
Mm-hmm.
There's relationships in
Yes.
all of nature
Right.
that that have to have happened simultaneously in the same location in order for things to work. And it's easier for you to believe that these things came about by chance versus by design, and you don't see how problematic that is because the probabilities are so massive. So for example, so take DNA, right? So you got this 6 billion
Strange.
words, what people call it.
They
There
call it
are
what? I'm sorry.
the longest word that there is because it gives direction. Each letter
Oh,
has
yeah. Gotcha.
all those
Yes.
sorts of things. And so you have all of this uh there's no other way to call it other than a code. It's a code.
There's
It tells
definitely other ways to call it that, but
well,
we can call
whatever
it
you
code.
call it, it's going to be reduced to that terminology that says this is informing this to do that, right? This
Sure.
is telling this what to do. If you take this out, these things, uh, if you tinker with it, you're going to get deformity. You're going to get lesser functioning outcomes, all of these things. And so when we talk about information that is sensible, that has instructions, which is what DNA has. Do you agree?
Sure, but you just said information that has
Instructions.
what information wouldn't have instructions? Isn't that redundant? That's what information is. So the genetic
Well,
code has,
all information does not instruct. I can have data that doesn't instruct. Instructions give an assignment.
that's not what the genetic code does. It does not give any assignment. It does not have
It
instruction.
absolutely does. It tells the cells what to do.
I don't like that wording, but okay.
Well, that's what happens if you remove it. They're telling that if those things are in this order, it tells these cells to do this, this, and this. It
Sure.
directs these proteins here. If they're in this order, it tells them to do this. If they're in this order, it
Yes.
tells them to do this. And that's all. Nobody denies that, right? What word we use is fine. I don't really care about that.
Okay.
How does that happen from an evolutionary perspective?
How did
Where does
DNA happen?
where does the information come from? Who's putting it in there? Where did it come from? How do you explain that?
Where does the information from DNA come from?
Correct.
The creatures that spawned it.
It has to have a beginning. Where did it come from?
I don't know. There's lots of theories. Technically, if you're talking about the very beginning of that, that would be pre-evolution. That's abiogenesis. And there is theories about like this uniform atom species, the beginning thing. I don't know. DNA came from RNA, so that's the evolution of the DNA is
Yeah,
ribonucleic acid.
even RNA is incredibly complex.
Yeah, of course. DNA is super complex. RNA is less complex. It's a little
DNA
bit
is
more simple.
RNA times 20, but
True.
RNA even itself is already ridiculously complex.
Complex, sure. There's a lot, but RNA is a simpler, more primitive version of DNA, and so that's where DNA came from. But I don't think that's what you're asking. You're asking like, where did the DNA information of like living organisms come from? They came from their predecessors. Like my DNA came from my parents. Yeah.
So you're okay with not having any understanding of how this beginning, this very base level requirement for life that tells this thing to do this and be this and do this and do that. How does evolution explain that?
Again, so a couple of things. You asked if I'm okay with not knowing. No, I hate that. I always want to know things. Um, I'm not comfortable saying we don't know what happened beyond this point, so let's make stuff up. Let's just throw out a guess. For example, let's just say God did it. Because if it turns out it wasn't God, then we have to look silly and we have to backtrack. And then there's that God of the gaps argument. We're taking God out of everything.
Go ahead. I'll let you finish.
Sure. So I'm just saying, like, what I don't want to do is go somewhere that the evidence doesn't lead. And so far, the evidence is saying we're good about here. After this, it's a lot of like, there's some ideas and some speculation. There's some working theories, but like, not sure. So I don't go beyond that. I don't like that. I would like to go further, but we don't know. And that again, if you're asking how far back, well, it stops being evolution. So if you say like, like for example, like people say like, well, what about before the Big Bang? Don't know, but that's not evolution. So evolution doesn't have to answer that. So if we're saying what happened at the very first genetic like nucleic acid, like what happened at the very beginning of that, that's not technically evolution. So evolution doesn't have to answer that. It's beyond its scope. Yeah, I don't want to I'm not comfortable not knowing, but I'm much more comfortable saying we don't know yet about stuff than saying I'm just going to jump to a conclusion and guess. Similarly, real quick,
Mhm.
the same thing with the argument about design. That's a common trope about like, oh, well, we see design everywhere. Design's not really in nature in that way, meaning intentional design. And so just because we think it's there, I'm not comfortable saying, well, then it must be this. It must be a mind who designed that. There's no justification for jumping that far yet.
The
Maybe one day.
dismissal, though, the dismissal of saying that we don't see design anywhere, it just goes to show how
But
much you take for granted the
yeah,
life. Wait. I'll let you go. I'll let you go. Like, you're in a world that works perfectly, that fits perfectly, and you're saying
no,
we don't.
no.
You're saying that we don't have evidence for when I breathe, when I go outside, I'm going to breathe out
Yeah.
CO2. And
Can we
then I'm
pause?
going to breathe in, no, I'm going to rant.
Okay, go for it.
And I'm going to breathe in oxygen. All righty.
Mhm.
I'm not going to jump because we're talking about evolution. I won't go into all the fine tuning stuff with the cosmology of the universe and Earth itself. But the number of elements that are perfectly suited and work together in unison, and for you to say we don't see evidence for design, I just don't understand. I don't understand
Sure.
that because there are planets that are very chaotic, and there aren't as many clear elements of design, even though I'm sure if we looked we'd see them there too. But
Yeah,
still, you know, we have this environment that's so perfectly suited, and to look at it and go, nobody does no, there's no evidence that these things were intentional. It's not, there's nothing about us even being able to have a logical, reasonable conversation. Nothing about any of this is evidence. More so, I would say, it's not evidence where there's more evidence for randomness than there is for design. You walk into a particular room, you've been into spaces that are chaotic, and you're like, what is going on in here? Things are all over the place. And you've walked into rooms where there's order, and you see order, you see functionality, we recognize order immediately. We're actually, we look for order, we establish order. There's something about us that desires order. You
yes,
would say because we evolved that way and we found out that that's better than not having order. And I would say, nope, order was plugged into us because we come from one who gives order, right?
sure.
And so to me, the conclusion that we don't see design when uh, I don't know if you got a chance to see. It was in Chicago too for a long time. The human body exhibit.
I'm familiar with it, but no, I didn't go see it, but I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
It if it ever comes back, go see it. It's phenomenal. It's ridiculous. They stretched out the veins and they just
Yeah.
went across the whole thing. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
And it's very awe-inspiring to see. You know, like we're wrapped in this skin. We don't get a chance to. We don't know what's going on to us with us until we got to go to the doctor. But you know, the way we're built, the way, and I'm going to use those words obviously, but the way we're built, the way that that all of those things come together and have all of the functionalities that they do, these systems that we have in our bodies, that if this is not working, then this is not going to work, and all these things working together, you may not agree with the conclusion that it's designed, but to say that we don't have things that appear to be designed is, I don't think that's a, a fair conclusion if you're looking, unless you're looking with a bias.
No, I absolutely agree with you. I 100% agree with you, though. And that is, you said the appearance of design. And I agree. That is not evidence of design.
It
That's
may
evidence of
not.
the
Yeah,
appearance of design.
I
And if we
I
know
agree.
that we are, hold on, I get my rant. If we know that we are like pattern recognizing systems, then we will overlook. Here's a pattern. We're like, oh, look at this. I found a pattern, right? It's like the lucky penny thing. So here's what I would say. I'm not saying that there isn't the appearance of design. I'm saying that that is from the viewer. It doesn't necessarily exist. And again, what I'm trying to, because of, we talk about evolution, we haven't really even talked about natural selection, which puts this thing into an ordered process. Nature does have like order, or it could have design. I don't like that word. I'm trying to say it's not intentional. It's not a mind saying, I want this, I want this, I want this. It's kind of like, I'm going to go off a random, it's kind of like coming to the bottom of a giant hill in the winter and saying, look at all these giant snowballs. How did they get here? Well, they rolled from the top and they were little things in the way. They never intended to become big snowballs. They weren't designed that way. But the natural system said, if you start up here a little, it's going to get, this is your end result. I think a tiny snowball couldn't like, a snowflake couldn't have like turned into this giant ball. That's how it processes. But real quick, this is critical. I hope that this hits home. There's a really fantastic analogy. I love analogies. I use them obviously a lot. There's a fantastic analogy. I think it's originally credited to JBS Holding. I could be wrong about that, but where he says, imagine one day that a small puddle in a pothole on a road becomes prescient, gains consciousness, and it looks around and it says, what an awesome situation I'm in. This pothole is perfectly designed to fit me. It's even got the right depth, because if it was a little bit shorter, I would be over the top. I'd spill over. It's not too deep. It's not deeper, because then I'd be like sinking in. I'd be taking in more water. Every crevice and every crack and bend of this thing fits my water perfectly. What a fantastic situation that I'm in. And obviously the analogy is that the pothole was not designed for the water or shift to that. The water molded itself to fit the pothole. Life, all life on Earth, has molded itself to fit its environments. The environments have not been built to fit us. If the Earth, the people talk about, like, if the Earth was 10 miles closer or 10 miles farther away from the sun, which is not true. The Earth varies in its orbital rotational time. But if the Earth was not habitable, life wouldn't be on this planet. That's the end of the story. It just wouldn't. It was, though. And you talk about, like, oh, I go outside and breathe and things like that. This whole thing is built. No, Jeric. We live in very specified areas on this planet. We don't live in the Sahara Desert. We don't live in the South Pole. We don't live high up on certain mountaintops where the oxygen is too thin that if you go out to breathe that beautiful air, you basically pass out. We don't live in certain areas like Australia, most of Australia, because it's so hot. We cannot live in about 70% of this planet because it's full of water, and we drown. Like, we have congregated to the areas that we can live. And then with even in that specification, we then were able to build up certain things so that we could kind of thrive. But that's this planet. Of the entire solar system, that's the only place we can survive. And that's not counting tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, volcanoes, all the other natural things that totally fuck us up. So there's a small segment within this planet that we can survive in. The rest, totally hazardous to us, and that's not counting all the animals or plants that we could eat or get bit by that would kill us. Within our solar system, that's it. Within the known universe, according to Stephen Hawking, when he was asked about this kind of question, and I'm not citing Stephen Hawking as the absolute authority, but as far as the cosmos, he's pretty good. And they asked him if the cosmos seemed designed for human life, and he said, the only thing I can tell, the cosmos was designed for the creation of black holes. That's it. That's what happens in the universe more than anything else. Black holes are born, collapse, and that's it. And then another one. And so we don't know the full extent of our cosmos, but of the known universe, which they estimate we can see about 12%, Earth is like 0.000000001.
It's ridiculously minute.
And so that's the only place in this whole panoply that we can exist. And on that planet, there's only certain places we can exist without frying to death or freezing or drowning. And within that, we can only eat certain things and can't go near certain animals or they'll kill us. That does not seem to be designed for us. Not to mention, the human body is actually really poorly designed. That's just a known fact. There are so many better designs. You talked about earlier about
the human body is poorly designed.
It just is. It is
Goodness
just a
gracious.
fact
You're
of
saying that as
nature.
you're telling me, you're talking with, that is wild, David. I pray that you never have to answer for that statement. But go ahead.
I'm fine answering for that statement because
No, you
it's a
aren't.
fact.
No,
Do you know
you
how many
aren't.
people die every
But go
single
ahead.
year from accidentally choking on something? Why? Because their breathing tube and their eating tube are right next to each other, and they start from the same hole. Which means sometimes if I want to breathe, I may accidentally cough something down that throat and choke to death and die. Anyone with a brain would design it where those are separate, but they don't. So thousands of people die every year just because of that from a simple design oversight. You could just not do that. But setting that aside, the eyeball as an example of this, human beings, and you didn't say human beings specifically, but human beings do not have the best eyes. They're also poorly designed, or at least they're moderately designed. They're fine. But we also can see the evolution of the human eye, light sensitive cells. And we see this in species that don't have eyes yet. They have light sensitive cells, which work to basically see certain things where light is. Other ones that are a little bit hard, they start to bow in and they can sort of trap certain lights and it can see the direction of shadow. So if you're looking for prey and suddenly there's a shadow, chase that. That could be food. And the evolution of eyes slowly comes along. And we see this is found in nature, in living
But
creatures.
wouldn't that be a knock on your worldview too?
The
If
evolution of the human eye.
if
I mean, not the human eye, the eye.
if if natural selection is supposed to allow for um, improvements, right? Um,
Uh, I guess I'll take that wording.
yeah, I mean that's the point, right? I mean, you're picking the best, and then you're going, and I mean, you're not going in. You don't believe that you go in the opposite direction. You don't believe that species get worse or less. Uh,
I think species go in, and again, species is not the word. I think genetics go in every single direction, and therefore that can be produced in a living organism. I think natural selection says the thing with no eyes in this environment, not good enough, so it dies off. So the things with eyes then continue on. So natural selection is the filter, but
yeah.
evolution just does changes. It does all like it makes combinations. What about this? No good? Okay. What about this? Good? Okay.
Um, yeah. So
And a knock on evolution is the eye.
no, I I appreciate that. Um, you know, to get a chance to kind of see uh where your perspective is. Here's what I learned. Um, you have the same set of data, right? And this is what needs to be understood is that there's interpretations of data. So every, you know, much of what you said was what was interesting to me was much of what you said was actually proof to me that there actually is a designer, right? But you
Okay.
see it as proof that there's not, right? And so
Not proof that there's not. No.
well, it sounds like you're very confident that there isn't
Proof,
because
but confidence and proof, I just want to be clear because this is the same thing about my atheism.
yeah,
I'm not saying I know it's not. I'm saying I don't see any evidence that that is there, so I'm not
well,
going to entertain that until.
right. And what I'm saying is that is not that you're not seeing the evidence, is how you're interpreting the evidence that you see, right? And so when evidence is placed before you, you're taking evidence, and this conversation is evidence of that, right? Because there are things that we can look at the same thing that I see as evidence for, and you see as either evidence against or insufficient evidence or evidence for evolution, right? But it's the same piece of evidence,
Can you
right?
give me an example?
So let's take well, the environment, for example, right? So I I see the environment and our being suited for it, which by the way, human God designed everything. So the whole world not being able to be inhabited by human beings is not any knock on God, because he also created all the animals for their own
Sure.
habitations as well. So
Yes.
that that's just God loving his whole creation. But when I see those things, and I see how um, the environment fits, you see us as adapting to the environment, right? Now, I would disagree that you have evidence to really support that. I think that you're interpreting things along the way as evidence to support that. Um, I'm not going to convince you otherwise. You know what I mean? That's just how you see
I'm
it.
open to it.
Yeah. And so I'm looking at it as I see how, what's the word I'm going to use? Chasm is the word that's coming to mind.
What's the word?
Chasm.
Chasm. Okay.
Chasm.
Yes.
Um, and we talked about this on the very first time that we talked. Not that there is like, you can't sort of uh, reason someone into a particular position either way. And you had mentioned that there were people who were professed theists who became atheists. Of course, there were people who were atheists who became theists,
Hmm.
as well. There's number of those as well. And I do think,
Atheists who became Buddhists and who stayed
yeah,
atheists.
there's reason does play have a factor um, where faith is involved
Yeah.
as well. The only thing I really want to point out to you is that when you come to a set of data, there is two things. One, there's an interpretation happening that's not just you're just looking at data and taking it. There is an interpretation happening, as
Mhm.
I am, right? But there is an interpretation happening there. And the other piece is that where you don't have an answer, you are injecting faith, whether you know it or not. Um, there is a faith that you have that science will find this out in time, and we just don't know yet. And so where you have um, where there's anything that is insufficient currently in the knowledge of the scientific community, what is being injected now is the opposite of what theists have been accused of, which is God of the gaps. There is this sort of time, time of the gaps piece that's like, well, just give us more time and we will figure it out. And the interesting thing is that so much of what we've learned has actually been in favor of a theistic worldview, but the commitment to a naturalistic worldview eliminates a theistic conclusion at the outset. And so you're in a circle, you know, you just you're just in a circle. Not you, I'm saying,
Mhm.
though that's just what ends up happening. Um, and I'm kind of just talking this through because I that's just kind of what my impression was after you got done speaking. It's like, oh, okay, well, we can. There's no point. We can if we can look at the same set of data and I see something as actually evidence for what I'm saying, and
Mhm.
you see it as evidence for what you're saying, that just shows me where that's just a
Yeah.
chasm
The
right there.
chasm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's just a chasm. Um, and so that's interesting. That's good to know, and all of those things. Um, I mean, when you said that the body is poorly designed, that hit me right here, David.
Why?
uh, but I get it. I could see how Um, I don't know how much I know you're well read. I know you're well educated. I know that you've looked at all of these things and gotten uh, gotten knowledge about these subjects. And I commend that because I feel like there's a lot of ignorant people who believe things without any type of investigation. And that's just I don't think that God wants that for his people.
Mhm.
I don't I don't think that that's good at all. I do think that we need to do that. Um, but I just want you to notice how easily you dismiss the rebuttals.
What do you mean?
Well, everything, right? I mean, everything we talked about.
Well, yeah, sure, but like, yes, that's true. But that's because, like, and I'm trying to figure out the proper way of phrasing this, but like, those rebuttals aren't any good.
Well,
All of
that's
those rebuttals have been like refuted and demonstrated to not be true or not work. It's like for example, coming back to like the Michael Behe thing, someone makes an assertion that says, "Oh, this challenges evolution," and then the scientists come back with like 17 studies and examples and say, "Well, what about all this?" And there's no response. It's like, well, okay. And then people just say, like, "What about the irreducible complexity?" That's already been addressed. That's not a rebuttal. We're still waiting on the rebuttal to the challenge that refuted that. So
yeah.
that's like what I'm talking about. But real
And
quick,
I'll send you one of the latest things that I saw because I
sure.
just I couldn't do it justice. But from what I understand, what he spoke about his response to all of those rebuttals that you mentioned that was done either in book form or some kind of way.
Yeah,
So I'm not
that's,
sure. I'm not
but
sure.
do you see the difference there?
What do you mean?
So Michael Behe wrote a book, Darwin's Black Box, where he first putted this forward. All
Yeah.
you have is an editor on that. After that, a number of scientists, two at Duke, I know, and then a couple other like prestigious scientific labs, did studies and then wrote peer-reviewed journals responses, meaning they submit
That doesn't
something.
mean anything to me though, that they're peer reviewed,
Why
honestly.
not?
Well, because you don't know, you don't see it, you don't believe that it's the case, but there's a ton of bias against anything that says any hint towards any type of intelligent design in the
Yeah,
scientific.
well, yes, you're true because it's not intelligent design. His argument isn't intelligent design.
Well, I'm just saying.
So and I don't accept that. Like I there is bias against intelligent design. Like and I'm not trying to I'm really not trying meaning to insult you, but there's like bias against that the same way there's bias against unicorns. Like that's not a real thing. We don't deal
Yeah,
with that.
it
But
doesn't insult me because
okay, cool.
I'm 40. I'm about to be 47. You
Okay.
know what I mean?
Right.
I know who I am. And I wanted,
I just meant like
talk about this.
they don't take that with it. Like, yes, there is bias against that, but they're just like, that's not a real thing. So no. But anyways, I don't know what to say if you're biased, if you don't if peer review doesn't mean anything. All I'm saying is that like how peer review works is that they run these tests, the experiments, and then they come up to conclusions. They publish it in a peer review paper. Other scientists follow that same rhythm, that same process, and say, yeah, that worked, or no, that didn't work. Check your stuff. It passed, and they were like, yes, this is accurate. Vihi, what do you say? Do you have any processes that you can show that counteract this, that challenge these conclusions? Because you said if we do this, this, and this doesn't happen. We did that, and it did. And then other people checked it, and it did. What do you got? And he wrote another book. He did not respond with a process that has to be examined by scientists. He wrote another book. That to me is someone being like that's like calling someone out and be like, show me your facts. And they just say, nah, I have them at home. But regardless,
Well, yeah, and I don't know. Yeah, I don't have enough information
sure.
about that
I want to say I don't want to go down that rabbit hole right now, but I
yeah,
like I know you said you're going to send me some stuff. I can send you some things on that because
yeah,
I don't want to keep saying things and you don't know about them. You're like, whoa,
yeah.
okay. Like I can send it.
And let me retract that. It's not that I don't because I'm not I'm not anti-science. One of the things you said on one of your YouTube videos was that you didn't believe that there was that God and science could coexist or something to that effect. That you
Yes,
didn't think that
correct.
faith and science maybe.
God, sure, but yeah,
Yeah, something along one of those two things. I don't remember which one.
yeah,
Um, and I disagree with that.
sure.
I don't think that there's any real um, conflict uh, that exists there when the science is interpreted correctly and the Bible is interpreted correctly. I don't think that there's a conflict there. I think what
That word
is
correctly though is doing a lot of heavy lifting.
well true, right? But
Okay.
there is a correct interpretation, right? Somebody has the correct interpretation of the data, right? There is
And the
there is a
Bible.
correct. I'm not saying that I have it. I'm not saying you have it. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that wherever that is, whatever that is, I don't think that God, for example, is opposed to science. I don't think that
Sure.
God feels challenged by science or is afraid that science is going to find out something to falsify him. I don't
Mhm.
think he cares one bit about those things along those lines. Like I said, if it's really um, being interpreted uh, correctly, which again, nobody will know until
They die.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
but I do think that from my perspective, when you think about um it's interesting, when the Big Bang was discovered, scientists were quaking in their boots because it seemed to draw a theistic conclusion. Um, it wasn't like, oh no, it wasn't the theists that were afraid of the Big Bang. It was scientists that were afraid of the Big Bang because the Big Bang demonstrates that there was a beginning of space, time, and matter. And
Which
so
scientists?
you said which scientists?
You said scientists were anti or turned off by the Big Bang, but
Oh, yeah.
theists weren't.
Okay, so that's another thing I'll send you as well. It definitely was
Sure.
not welcome. It was very much resisted.
Sure.
And
The term Big Bang is actually derisive. It was by a guy who was anti-Big Bang, quote unquote, and was like making fun of it and was like,
yeah, I
"Oh, they
mean,
think there was a
and I'm
Big
not,
Bang."
I'm saying what the event is describing, not necessarily the terminology. I'm just
Okay.
saying that the
Yeah.
idea, the discovery of space, matter, and time having a beginning was controversial to scientists, not controversial to theists. It was controversial to scientists because space, matter, and time having a beginning actually speaks directly to Genesis 1:1. And so um, that is when you look at the flow of um, discoveries over time, and even since then, and the more that is discovered, even since we talked about, you said evolution doesn't depend on Darwin. It
Yeah.
was predated Darwin. He made it famous with his book and all of that kind of stuff. Um,
Yeah.
but so much of what is continued to be taught, as far as in high schools across the country, are still based on heavily on Darwin's understanding of evolution, and and what he knew then versus what we know now on a cellular level. Much of what those things are, he would have had much trouble with. One thing I didn't talk to you about was the Cambrian explosion as
Yeah.
well, um, which is, you know, the opposite of what would have been expected from an
Sure.
archaeological standpoint.
Yeah.
Um, what do you do with that?
What do I do with the Cambrian explosion?
Yeah, how do you is it a we just is your position we just don't have enough fossils yet, or how do you explain the diversification of species in a shorter period of time that evolution wouldn't allow for the evolving of this diversification of species in that short period of time prior to the Cambrian explosion. So you have these single cell organisms, and then all of a sudden you have, you know, tens of different species
Sure.
that are
Yeah.
all very different in a short
Um,
period of time that wouldn't allow for the slow, gradual processes of evolutionary change.
yeah, sure. So I'd say a couple of things. One, I mean, there's no problem with the Cambrian explosion within an evolutionary model at all, other than kind of what you said was that it wasn't expected. Yeah. Um, but coming back to somewhat our conversation earlier about like the fossils, and we don't have the fossils, etc. Fossilization is a really difficult process, meaning like it's lucky to happen. For a organism to die and then become fossilized, like that's an aligning of the stars. So one of the, if you want to say assumptions or presuppositions that scientists do make is that if we get a fair amount of fossils of something, it's fair to assume that that was a large population of that species. Because if there was one unicorn, the possibility of it fossilizing is like so small. But if we get a lot of them, there must have been a lot of these things to have this many die and fossilize. Because they, I don't know, but like they say like a fifth or less than that probably, but like 2% of any population will fossilize.
Mhm.
So we have zero fossils of jellyfish. Why? Because they're soft-skinned organisms. They don't have they're invertebrates. They don't have any hard structures. So there's like nothing to fossilize. Like the chances of that are bad. So Precambrian, a lot of the living organisms that all life is in the water are like that, are soft structures. They're not exclusively, but some, a good amount. And so the chances of getting and a large amount of fossilized organisms is kind of small. When you say the Cambrian explosion, which is a bad term, but it's not yours, happened suddenly. Suddenly is like 60 million years.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, from an
So
evolutionary standpoint, it's sudden.
sudden, sure, sudden from an evolutionary standpoint. But one of the things that came about in the Cambrian explosion is exoskeletal structures, organisms that had an exoskeletal. And that's something that can fossilize a lot better. That's why there's seashells. We see like seashells and on fossilizing all the time because those are hard structures, the exterior of which, and so it can go. As opposed to like you and I, where our hard structure is on the inside, so you can have that whole thing ripped apart and spread about and blah blah blah. If like a sea cell structure dies, the organism is inside, and then this hard structure is what remains. That can fossilize. So the Cambrian explosion, in part, is because fossilization suddenly had so many more opportunities as that. Secondly, so that's just a process of why there is this Cambrian explosion. It's not because suddenly there was way more life. It's because that life could suddenly be preserved. So they're probably.
But it's just that that life is diverse. If you're talking about one or two
Life was
different,
diverse for that, but we see a diversification of life anyways. But hold on, I recognize that. There's this other thing called punctuated equilibriums, which is a huge factor in all of this. Stephen Jay Gould, if you're familiar with him, genius, brilliant man. If you ever want to know anything about evolution, Stephen Jay Gould came up with one of the things why he's super famous is he came up with this thing called punctuated equilibriums, where the basic idea was we believed at the time, somewhat from Darwin, that evolution is a steady, slow process, bit by bit, by bit by bit, and everything sort of does. And what Gould pointed out was what we tend to see is that species will sort of become specialized in their environment, and then evolution sort of slows down, meaning like alligators and sharks have not evolved much in millions of years. Why? Because they are suited to their environment and they stay in that environment. And so there's no demand, there's no pressure to do this. They can kind of remain. That's not to say they don't evolve, but like they don't manifest in any extreme ways. They've sort of mastered that environment. When environments suddenly shift, you will have a smaller segment of the population that becomes isolated. So, for example, if just thinking like there's deer and they move around this big open area and they cross this river, and then one day something happens in this river, like the river's actually on a fault line and it expands a lot more. And so there's 4,000 deer here, and then there's 500 deer that are separated over here, and they're part of this group. But now there's a smaller population that's separated entirely. This population is punctuated out from this, and the equilibrium or the balance that this species has like been having is suddenly rendered useless for this group, and they will suddenly go through a quote rapid change or evolution. Why? Because their environment has changed from the mass population, and so they will suddenly begin to change much faster in evolutionary terms. And this group may not reflect that. That's something that happened at the Cambrian explosion. The changes in the environment of the water, levels within CO2 and oxygen of the Earth in general shifted dramatically at this time. And suddenly, because of that, you have like sort of a mass dying, one of the 6 or 7 mass extinctions. And so then the remaining organisms then begin to change rapidly in evolutionary terms because they have greater opportunity, greater environment, etc. Same thing with mammals. Like mammals have been around a long time. The reason why they sort of exploded was because the dinosaurs died, which simply meant like they weren't being eaten all the time by shit, and they could sort of like they were free to roam around. And suddenly their populations increased, and then diversification happened because they had free reign. That's kind of what happened with the Cambrian explosion. So it's a process that we can see more, and the diversification suddenly happened because they had suddenly free reign to grow and expand more in this way. Environmental change, basically. That's the short answer.
I wrote down Stephen Gould's. You said Stephen J. Gould. I'm
Yep.
assuming that's Gould.
Yeah, if you're writing people down, Ken Miller, I highly recommend.
I think I'm aware of Ken Miller. Yeah.
Yeah, he's a devout Catholic, but also in pretty strong. He writes high school textbooks on evolution. He was key
Oh, I
witness.
think that's where I might have saw
Yeah,
a debate or
he
something.
was also a key witness in the debate around intelligent design that Michael Behe was on trial for. Or not on trial, but he was part of it.
That might be where I saw his name. I'm not.
Yeah. Dover versus Katzmiller, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Anyways.
I'll hold that. I'll hold that question.
Okay, I have 2 questions briefly. I don't know how much time you have. We don't have to spend more, but I did have 2 quick questions.
You can do your 2 quick questions, and then I'm over time on my end. I told my wife.
Okay. Sorry. Briefly then. So one was you had said this sort of common trope, which I was curious about, which this wasn't your exact wording, but that you basically said science takes faith too, or people have faith in science.
Mm-hmm.
I want to know what your definition of faith is there, because I vehemently am opposed to that idea. I don't believe that I do. I proportion my trust to things that are verifiable and evidenced. The same way I have a lot of trust in friends that like are consistent, and then those friends that I found out were lying to me a couple times, I don't have as much trust in.
Sure.
You could say, well, you don't, but you have faith in this person. I don't like the term faith there. As science, in my view, has demonstrated itself trustworthy.
Well,
And so
even though science has rewritten itself, I mean, it's not like every scientific discovery has been
correct.
Yeah. So,
correct.
so
Absolutely. That's the greatest thing in the world. Because
Right.
if they found this thing and they said, hey, it's X, and then new evidence came up that it wasn't, and they're like, it's X, they adjust according to the evidence. They're always willing to go and say, you know what? We kind of thought it was
always.
this. Looks
Not
like
always.
this is more, okay. But anyways, that's one of my second questions, but let's go to this one.
But so you use the word. I mean, the word is trust. You know, that's the basic.
Oh, okay.
Faith is trust. So what are you trusting in? You're trusting in what you just said. You trust that science will find the answer. Now, it's trust based on, in your view, it's trust based on history, it's trust based on experience, it's trust based on, it's not blind trust, which is what I think atheists think faith is, which is blind faith, which is that's not true either. But it is trust that you borrow from, I'll take it like this: you borrow from the equity that you believe science has in the past, and you use that equity to fill the gap for what you don't know that may or may not come in the future. But you're borrowing from this knowledge equity that has been established in your view, and you say, based on that, I don't know this yet, but I'm going to borrow from this past equity here, and I'm going to use that equity and just hold that until that discovery is made and it shows itself to be true. That's faith. That's saying, that's saying,
Hmm.
uh, I don't know this yet. I don't have that answer, but between now and then, I'm inserting something that allows me to rest sure in my current position, right?
What am I inserting?
You said who? Did you say who are you inserting, or what are you
What am
inserting?
I? You said that I'm inserting, but
You're inserting this faith. You're inserting trust. You're inserting. You're saying it's between now and today, and the time that we discover this. You have to put something there, and so
hmm,
that is, I'll call it faith. You'll call it trust. You'll call it the word we use doesn't matter, but something is being put there that allows you to say, even though I don't know this for sure, it hasn't been proven yet, hasn't been discovered yet, even though I don't know this for sure, I'm still okay because of how firm I am and what I currently do know, right?
hmm.
There's no difference between that's the definition of faith. It's just faith in that, faith in the uh there's faith in science itself, faith in man, even faith in um those two things. We don't need God because we can figure it out. We will be able to do it on our own. We will discover the why, and when we do, it'll settle that. So I don't even have to worry about it because I know in the future someone else will figure that out. That is faith. There's no other way to describe what that is. That's faith. um
I would describe it other ways. Faith has a very religious connotation.
Well, you think it has a religious connotation, but it doesn't have a religious connotation. The word you have faith in a bank, right? I mean, you can have
I
faith
wouldn't
in,
use that word for bank. I understand
well,
the definition, but I'm saying
historically
the
it has
use.
been, you know what I mean?
Yeah, but the usage is pretty, colloquially speaking, is pretty ubiquitous. That faith has that sort of base connotation.
Oh, well, then don't use
Regardless,
faith. Say trust then. You're
yes, but
trusting
here's the more important point that I want to shift on that briefly because I know, and then I want to go to my second question. But that was this: is that almost like I want to correct sort of a misunderstanding. My trust isn't that science will get to the answer. Maybe it won't. Lots of questions probably won't. That science will expose or clarify or be correct. It's not. To use an analogy, I have a really old jalopy, my friend's car that has 3 flat tires, and that one car that is kept in really good condition that always never fails me. If you ask me what's the car that you believe can get you best to that destination, I'm going to say that car. Maybe it won't. I'm not saying I know it will. I'm saying that's the best method I have for getting there. Doesn't mean I will, but it's the best one. That for me is science. I'm not saying science can answer everything. I'm not saying we'll always answer everything. You said some more about like science is the time, like it's the instead of God of the gaps, it's time of the gaps. Like give us enough time, we'll get there. I don't think that. Like it may not answer everything, but if you do look at the explosion of information and the things that were too beyond our understanding or knowledge that suddenly did step within the boundaries of what we can know in the past 100, 200, 400 years, it's pretty incredible. I think that's a fair sort of guess to be like, we'll probably get there. But my point is, I don't have faith or trust that science will answer it. My trust is that science is the most reliable, proven methodology for coming up with any answer if we can have an answer. There's other systems, they're not as reliable. This is the one that is the most reliable one. So I'm not going to go with anything else until they show that they can be as reliable as this one. Again, like you pointed out, that's not to say this one won't be wrong sometimes, but the only system that corrects those wrongs is this system. Every time science has been correct about something, faith, voodoo, roll of die have not fixed it. Science has corrected itself. It fixes its own mistakes. So more of like it's not the destination, it's the journey. That's what I have the
Yeah.
trust in, if that makes difference. I don't think science will answer all things. I think, again, coming back to my analogy of religion, I think religion or faith or God or whatever, if it's metaphysical, science is constrained entirely within the physical. It cannot touch on those things. So science will never be able to answer those things. So, but anyways, my second question was, and this one can travel beyond, we don't have to spend a lot of time unpacking this because I know you said you're going to send me some stuff, but I would be interested. You talked about interpretation, that we could look at the same set of data and come
Sure.
with different conclusions. I could look at a set of data and say evolution, and you could look at it and say God and creationism. Can you give me examples of that? What data that might be?
Well, we already talked about, one, for example. So I look at the human eye and I go, that is design. And I'm just going to really oversimplify this, but that is design. You look at it and go, no, actually, science or natural selection goes, these organisms can't see, these ones can. Seeing is better than not seeing, so therefore, there's the eye. And I think the processes between not seeing and seeing are, in my view, just on this example, far more complicated than what is being alluded to, in order for evolution to be able to solve that, for example.
So you're saying that the process by which we go from light sensitive cells to an eye is so complicated that evolution can't explain it. Did I get that, Miss?
Yeah, that's fair. That's
Okay.
fair. Um, that's fair. So that's one, that's one example. I would say, um, you talked about order earlier, that there is an order, but it's because of natural selection ruling out these things here and there. And it, and you didn't use these words, but how I got it is order was kind of just settled upon. Like we just kind of got there eventually because of, that's just how it all kind of like it was just shaking like this, which is kind of the evolutionary view. You're just kind of shaking it, and then stuff just kind of, and then the best stuff trickles down, and then what you have there left is sort of good to go, and then great, we're good to go because that sifting has happened through environmental changes, through uh these adaptations, through these things that have happened, and the environment is the cause of
Order.
the diversity of life, the order,
I would
the
say real quick, sorry.
yeah.
Yes, that's a good summation. You used a couple words like it was finalized. I'm saying it's always that. So it was never or disorder and now it's order. It's always there's some disorder and then it resets. And then like we're always doing that. There's always this sifting and shifting and whatnot.
And one of the things, we've been using the word science a lot here, and one of the things, just, and I understand it's a different science, but we're when we talk about science, we're talking about something that's observable and repeatable. And uh, none of these things that we're talking about as far as evolution are either of those,
What do you mean?
meaning that you can't replicate any of these things, right? You can't replicate um, the evolutionary process, right? And
Yeah, you can. They've totally done it. Well, like, what do you mean by evolutionary process? Then I'm not clear. What, like, we've in laboratory studies, experiments, we have caused evolution to happen.
you've caused microevolution to happen. You haven't caused
Um,
you haven't caused macroevolution to happen.
Oh yeah, that's a real quick briefly because that was something at the beginning that I never touched on. Macro and microevolution are good examples of us to contextualize how we talk about small changes versus large changes. Microevolution is a genetic change. Macroevolution is populations. So you'll never get this to do this per se, but they absolutely happen. There is no genetic barrier that doesn't
You're
this.
speaking these absolutes. I love it. I love the
Okay.
confidence.
Well, let me give you a good example
I
of this
love
because
it.
this is the best analogy I've heard. Macroevolution are seconds. Microevolution are seconds. Macroevolution are centuries. And you're saying these can never add up to this.
I'm
All
saying
those
you
more of
can't.
them.
I'm saying you can't show that they
But
added up to that.
we
Which
have
you haven't.
genetically.
You
We
can't
have.
show that.
I'm writing down a list of things to say.
Please do, because it's just it's only going to be some interpretation of data, but you can't show that. You can't show a ant becoming a bee. You just can't show that.
If we showed that, that would disprove evolution. That's not how things never like. So real
But
quick,
that's
I
my
know.
point. That's my point, though, David. My point is that my point
Mhm,
is we're calling it science, and
mhm.
it's not observable and it's not repeatable.
It is though. It is reserved. It is being tested and observed and repeated.
Okay.
I mean, like they
Okay.
are. It really is.
Yeah, we won't get there because
Okay.
well, you're saying that because we can do this and you because we can do this, if we just repeat this, repeat this, repeat this, we'll get here. But you can't show how you can do that. And you don't see how you're inserting.
The fossil record shows you that.
No, it doesn't.
Genetic sequencing shows you that.
No, it doesn't. But
Taxonomy
anyway,
shows you that.
okay. What was your
Last thing.
follow-up or the last question?
Yeah. It wasn't so much a question. It was a framing.
Mhm,
It's another analogy. It's my last analogy because I'm trying to use analogies because I think they work well, and I hope this one breaks through.
mhm,
Because this speaks to everything you were just talking about. Everything.
mhm,
Evolution should be understood as its best comparison of, from humble me, is language.
mhm.
Evolution does not occur at the individual level. It occurs through generations and populations. I don't evolve. Humans evolve. Language happens not on an individual level, but in populations over long stretches of time. Language always evolves, always changes.
Mhm.
Latin is a dead language. It is a fossil language. It spawned the Romantic languages.
Sure.
Spanish, Portuguese, French. These are all born out of it. But we cannot go to the person and say, so you spoke Latin, but you gave birth in a kid and that kid started speaking French. How did that happen? And if
Mhm.
we can't do that, you can say, well, then French clearly didn't come from Latin, but it did. And just because we can't find, for example, that point, because it's not one person who gives birth to someone who speaks a different language. It's a younger generation using slang, new words, or antiquated words and phrases that sort of die off. And then, but they're still speaking the same language as their parents. And then the next generation is speaking slightly different things, new slang, new words, whatever, and they're speaking slightly different things. And eventually, after thousands of years, this generation, this kid is speaking a language that his great 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 grandfather would never understand. But at no point was he unable to talk to his child or his child to his child, and on and on and on. It's slow, slight changes over mass populations over enough time. Evolution is the exact same thing. English is a fairly new phenomenon in terms of language, fairly new in the history of the world.
Mhm.
Where did it come from? Who was the first person to start speaking English? No one. No one person just started talking up and started saying these words like this because it wouldn't make any sense. It was a slow, gradual process of a change of another type of language. And that language may still exist, it may not. It may have died off. But that's how evolution works. And so, sort of saying, like, well, you can't see the thing, it's kind of like saying, well, like, we know Latin existed and we know French exists and we know this came from it, but we can't find the one person who spoke both or the kid who spoke a different language as parents, even though we know that's not how this works. That's not evidence that the evolution of language doesn't occur. It
Yeah.
does. It's happening right now. And that's
That's
another,
a
we talk
that's a
about it like it's
category fallacy, though. That's a category fallacy.
how.
Like
It's an
language,
analogy. It's not a category fallacy.
language it evolving. Language itself is still one category. It's people using uh, sounds and syllables in different ways and adding meaning to them, and all of that is
Yeah.
happening. And then that is morphing and changing over time. I think it's a beautiful picture, but it's not the same as going from uh, an an ant or a protozoa and winding up with 300,000 different species here, doing that with like I said, insects, plants and flowers and fruit and all of those things, and animal life and sea creatures and flying things. And your answer to that will be, well, you just got to add a bunch of billions of years to it, and then that solves the problem. And I would say that's a very um, greatly minimizing the complexity of life and comparing it with language. It sounds good. I get that. Language does evolve, but it's two, you're talking two totally different animals here, no pun intended, between the complexity of life and all of the elements within life on a cellular level at that, and comparing that to this one category of human function that can obviously and does change over time.
Hmm.
Um, I see the analogy. I just don't think that it's a fair analogy with the complexities that are involved with life.
I, sure, it's an analogy that simply tried to point out a couple of things. One, that it's based on the mechanism is populations and change through generations.
Sure, I see it. I saw the. I mean, I
And that
thought you
it's
did a good
small
job.
incremental changes. And just
I
because
got
we
it.
don't know the first person who ever started speaking, just like we don't know where life started, does not disprove language, just like that doesn't disprove evolution. It's a small incremental thing over long periods of time. I'm not saying, well, because we have billions of years, like we have billions of years. And so that helps explain this process over time. Um, I think you're sort of overstating like in a biologic or a scientific perspective, I guess, like the complexity of life. It's complex, no doubt about it. And yes, there's thousands of languages and there's hundreds of millions of species of groups. Like this is way more diverse. The analogy is doing lifting there, but like I think it functions just simply to know that like changing to your environment and small changes in that over generations add up to this. And we see that. And just because we can't point out a specific linchpin of something doesn't, and so we focus in and say, well, where's this like where's the missing link type thing? And we find it and they're like, oh, well, what about this link, etc. Like just because we don't have that doesn't mean if you stand back, you see, oh, this language slowly changed into that language. That's what happened. That's what evolution does.
Um, One of the things that you mentioned, and I'll say this, you talked about science. One of the things that you appreciate about, and I agree. I think that's admirable too. Again, I'm not anti-science. I'm not someone that's like, oh, science is bad. Science is responsible for a lot. All I think science does is explain how God does what he does. That's why I don't feel like he's threatened by
Challenge.
it. It's just all it can do is say how. It can't say why. It can't say, a lot of things. But um, so I don't see an incompatibility there. And so uh, what I will say is that where science changes and morphs, God does not.
Sure.
And so when there is an apparent um, conflict or discrepancy between some scientific finding and what I believe the Bible says, especially something that is, indisputable, no matter how you try to interpret it, any decent, good, solid interpretation is going to interpret this way. Um, where science says this, and this is the difference between you and I. Because science has also been wrong on many of its discoveries, I don't panic if I see some scientific discovery that seems to disprove the Bible, because I can do the same thing. I can wait 20 years and somebody else will come out and might say something different. So if I get rocked by every single supposed scientific discovery immediately when it happens, right? I know just in my lifetime, things have, we used to believe this and now we believe this and now we believe this and so on and so forth. So I'll never be sort of rocked by anything that science uh, discovers because of that piece. But so much of what has been discovered, you talked about the last 100 years. The last 100 years of science have been fantastic for the Bible. It's been fantastic in my view for creation. There is more proof, in my view, of the natural conclusion being that there is a creator
Mhm.
as a result of scientific discoveries over the last 100 years than before the last 100 years, where it was stuff that was just taken flat out on faith and uh, where the God of the gaps may have really been a real thing,
Mhm.
where and but now when I look at every time I see something, I'm like, man, that's proof, that's proof, that's proof, that's proof.
Can you
Uh,
send me some of that? Like, I know you said you're going to send me some things. Can you send me
sure.
those as well?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is for jokes. All you're gonna do is explain them away with some naturalistic
If they can
explanation.
be explained away, then yeah.
Uh,
But I want to see them.
yeah,
I
yeah,
want to see this evidence. I want to hear
sure.
these arguments.
I'll send you some stuff with. I
Sure.
talked a little bit about some fine tuning things that I think demonstrate, like you talked about earlier, this planet out of all of the whole universe, which is too vast for us to even, people talk about exploring the universe. It's like, you're not going to explore the universe. I mean, you can't even get out of the solar system,
Sure.
it's
As an
uh,
aside to that, though, they have done studies on planets that are within the habitable zone of a large star that would be able to sustain human life.
yeah, yeah, yeah. There's a bunch of them.
And on an estimate, like a conservative estimate of total solar systems, total planets, total habitable zones, it's like 100 million
Yeah.
planets that
And
could have life.
I had a friend ask me one time, he said, what would happen? He said, what would happen to your faith? I mean, you might get a kick out of this, I don't know. But he said, what would happen to your faith if they found out that there were aliens? I'm like, nothing. He's God of the universe. They would be worshiping the same God. It doesn't mean anything to me. It doesn't, um, and so I don't know who's going to be in heaven. You know what I mean? I might it might be a whole thing. But anyway, so my ultimate view um, is that when I look at some of these things, I get excited. I'm excited about some of the findings as we look on a microscopic level and see the basic building blocks of life. When I look at DNA and I look at the information contained in it. Um, and I see that those pieces of information, information doesn't just come from nowhere. It just never does. Um, you've read a bunch of books. Um, what is the last? It's probably been a while, but what's the last book that you've read from a theist, um, refuting some of these arguments that you're making even now?
The last book I read from a theist refuting evolution
Or
or
yeah, we'll
creation
just say
or
evolution,
atheism.
just creation in general, but including evolution.
I've never read anything that refutes creation because, it all exists. Um, but the last book I read refuting evolution specifically. Um, yeah, I don't. Yeah, it might have been the book Michael Behe wrote after the Black Box. There was another book I read more recently, like 5 years ago or something. That was it was an excerpt within. It was a textbook from a number of different sources, all Catholic thinkers, theologians, and there was like a whole chunk in there that was about it, but that wasn't a sole book. That
Yeah,
was
yeah, yeah.
that. So the last like only full book that was against evolution was Michael Behe.
So one of the things that might be, you know, interesting, because like I said, I'm not, you know, I don't study science. I'm not, this isn't, I know enough to have a sort of a basic understanding because I don't want to be um, ignorant. I want to have a broad level knowledge of things, especially
Mhm.
just as a pastor. These are questions that come up.
Sure, people ask.
Constantly trying to educate myself around these things. But it would be good. I would be interested in getting your response to some of the um, arguments against some of these things, or arguments for design, for example, that speak about them more uh, intelligently and concretely and with the science to back it, because it's not just people coming up with stuff out of nowhere,
Mhm.
in my view. And I would be interested to share some of those, maybe even you know do a reaction type situation to some of those things.
Yeah,
That could be interesting as well.
yeah, I'm totally fine. If you want to send me the either the book or thing, I do want to
Yeah.
clarify. So I've read a lot of articles,
Hmm.
not books, um,
That's good.
either that have been published around intelligent design, and then responses to them, peer-reviewed, responses to those challenges, or creationist arguments, and then the refutations of those. But those aren't books; they're articles
Hmm.
um, in various things. But yeah, I would be open to if you have books, tell me what they are, and I can find them, or I can read them online, PDF, or if you have articles or whatever, um,
Yeah,
or
I'll
even
shoot you.
like a general author, something.
Frank Turek is good. Um,
I know the name.
uh,
Oh, I think I do know who Frank Turek is. Oh no. Yeah. Okay.
um, I found him to be solid. I haven't really seen anybody, you know, he stands up to all of the
Mhm.
arguments, and they're all the same. They're not really, you know what I mean? But on both sides, you know what I mean? They're not really, it's not like there's not really any new arguments that are coming out per se. And again, so a lot of it comes down to, you know, worldview. And I know a lot of people are like, well, are you one of those people that are like, I don't have a worldview? Do you feel that way about yourself, or do you recognize that you do have a worldview?
No, I have a worldview.
Yeah, I've just heard a lot of atheists say, I don't have a worldview, because they see that.
Atheism is not my worldview, but I
Yeah,
have a worldview.
yeah. Well, not believing in God impacts all of your thinking, whether you realize it or not.
Sure, but that doesn't direct you in any way. So, for a thing I like to point out, Buddhists are a large segment of most common Buddhist denominations are atheist.
Yeah,
So, if saying I'm an atheist, but I believe in the metaphysical, well, then I'm a Buddhist. If I think that there's a plan and a structure or design guiding this, I can be Buddhist. Like, atheism doesn't tell you enough about that. There are atheists that are not naturalists. They're things like that. So,
yeah. And I think there's the same variation within theism, right? Because
mhm.
what I think about, there's uh, three important questions that everybody answers whether they realize it or not. Number one is there a God? Everybody comes to some conclusion about that. If there is a God, what is he like? What is his nature? What is he like?
Why is he a he?
how is he it? It doesn't matter. I don't
Okay.
care. What is God like? We don't have to say he. What is God like? And then what does God want? That's number three.
Yeah.
And so, however a person answers those three questions is going to determine how they live their lives. Um, and so, within theism, what is God like and what does he want? There's a bunch of different ways that people can answer that. That's going to direct their behavior, the way they see things, the way they interpret, um,
Yeah.
their interactions, all of that kind of stuff. And so, yes, to your point, being an atheist doesn't pin you down to a singular worldview that is in line with every single atheist, right? That would be absurd.
Mhm.
Uh, but answering that first question in a negative or even with a giant question mark still does direct, which you agree anyway, so there's no point in
Yeah,
me.
I agree.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
I still think though that like even those questions, there's more like I think a fourth question would be like, do I care? Meaning like you can conclude there isn't God, and you could conclude that there is a God or gods that want things of you, and you could be like, I don't care. One of
yeah,
my sorry,
yeah, that's true.
I'm thinking, for example, like one of
I don't
my
think it's
conclusions.
wise, but it's true.
Sure. If I think that many gods, historically, the way they've been projected, are immoral, and so they may exist and they may want things, and I may say, I don't care. You're not. You're shitty, and so
Yeah.
I'm indifferent to whatever it is you want. It's sort of a Euthyphro dilemma, and I think that's kind of an important question in a way.
But
So
that's a what is God like? You're answering
yes,
that
it
question,
comes
right?
after
Yeah,
the
correct,
first one.
correct.
Yeah,
Yeah,
true,
yeah,
true, true.
yeah.
Anyways,
Uh,
that's wandering into more theology, which I'm
yeah,
totally.
yeah, 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 yeah.
Um,
So
but I know you're short on time or you have other commitments. So yeah. Do you have
did
any
you have another
final last
question?
words? Anything?
No, I think what this did for me, I think I understand you better.
Okay.
Um, and that's helpful, to kind of know where you're coming from and um
Where I'm going?
I'm not God. I don't know where you're going.